who you surround yourself with is so important. They either lift you up or they break you down.
It's Thursday, August 22nd, 2019, from Narrowway Cafe on the beautiful Avenue of Fashion. Although under construction, it's still beautiful. This is your Daily Detroit. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson, and Jer, I would challenge that, actually. It's not so beautiful out there right now. It's really torn up, and they've taken all the trees out temporarily.
But there is easy parking in the back. Just take the alley.
It's late summer. Things slow down a little bit. Think of this episode as a summer book at the beach before fall hits us, with crisp breezes, fresh apples, and hectic schedules.
So today, we're going to talk about having meaning in your everyday life. To chat about that is Lynne Golodner. She's the host of the Make Meaning podcast.
Before Jer takes us into that, a quick word from our sponsor for this episode, Repurpose. Repurpose is where you can get hired by Detroit's best startups and companies. Repurpose connects top talent like you with purpose-driven companies based on values, experience, and culture fit. Join their talent community at repurpose.co. That's repurpose.co.
Welcome to Daily Detroit.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is, number one, it's a bit nerdy. You're a fellow podcaster, so It's always good to have another one of those. But you have a podcast that focuses on something that I think we need to dive into a little bit nowadays. You know, that media diet out there, it's pretty tough to deal with. Work can be a real pain. You know, whether you're working for the man or working for yourself, right? People need inspiration and they need meaning. You've got to have a reason for doing something. And so your show, the Make Meaning podcast, I felt like it kind of tied into that. And I want to talk to you about that and how we can kind of move those things forward, because there was a recent study that I read that said that more than half of people are basically, their passion is not their day job, but their side hustle.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right? So that tells me there's a lot of people that are not aligning their meaning to their everyday.
Sure.
Where do you come into some of this? How did you get into even caring about making meaning for other folks?
So I was a journalist for 15 years before I started my marketing company, which is called Your People. And most of the articles that I wrote for magazines and newspapers around the country focused on how people found meaning in the mundane. And I used to say that, on my website, and I'm writing about how people make meaning in the mundane. And that's really like, what are the little moments each day or the little things that bring joy that people engage in, whether it's in their work or not? And so that's been a theme in my life. And then when I pivoted from journalism to marketing and PR, it was out of necessity. The economy was tanking and I had 3 very little kids. I was a single mom. And so I needed to earn a living. And so it was a very practical pivot, but I didn't have the luxury at that time to really dive into this meaning question. And thankfully, as things have turned around and as my business has grown and I have that time, I've gotten back to it because it's something that I find fascinating and essential, that we all need to be inspired in little ways and big ways every day. Otherwise, it becomes sort of a drudgery. And so I started the Make Meaning podcast a year ago, really as a marketing tool. But the funny thing is, it's not really marketing what I do. It's now driving another pivot for our company. We're launching something called the Message, Meaning, Purpose movement, because so much of what we do is work with individuals and companies on how they take their meaning and make something profitable out of it or that pays their bills. And I think that's because they're so passionate about it that it doesn't feel like work. So yeah, they end up doing well, but it's because they're doing good and because they're doing something that really lifts them up every day that it just grows. And so I think this is one of my passions about, let's find the good in the world. And you're right that media can be covering the negative stories or the sensational, jaw-dropping stories, but there are so many more good stories out there. And I just think we need to have a forum to share them and put them out there.
You talk about that whole mixture of making profit out of things that you love. I can tell you, as somebody who does, as part of my living, something that I love, It's also really hard to put those things together. And there's a lot of compromises. How do you find that North Star through that?
Well, the reality is we work to make a living so that we can pay our bills, and we all have that. And so some of us are lucky that we can work for ourselves or set the hours or the tasks. But, I'll be honest. I mean, I'm a writer at heart and I love to write. Am I getting paid to write poems? No. but I'm blogging for clients. I'm working on their social media content. I'm writing press releases, and I get to use my skills. But what I find inspiring is not that I get to write. It's that I am working with people who really have a big heart for what they do, and I want to help them get that out there. So that helps differentiate any business, any entrepreneur, any nonprofit. When you tell the human stories and the passion stories, then people want to align with what you're doing, and that's just a win-win.
My inbox overflows with pitches that don't have stories with them.
Mm-hmm.
And the stories with pitches, or the pitches with stories, make a lot more difference than X and X quarterly thing for Y Acme company.
Right.
And with that in mind, so one of my mentors one time told me that sometimes it doesn't matter exactly what you're doing, but who you're doing it with.
Yeah.
How important is it to be surrounded by the right people and having meaning and being inspired?
So that's huge. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because who you surround yourself with is so important. They either lift you up or they break you down. I had an experience recently where I was catching up with someone who has, I think, always been kind of negative, like everything is glass half empty. And I came away from this, catch up with her and thought, I don't know that I want to do that again, because my spirit was lower, because everything was like, this is what's wrong. This is the negative. And so I think that when you have people who build you up, who appreciate your talents, we all have good and bad. And so somebody could break you down and be like, you misspelled that, or you don't have that creativity in this or whatever, that you're going to start believing that. Otherwise, if you have people who, sit there and point out what you did really well, you're going to lift up to that and keep going.
How important is that kind of talk? Because I think it's important sometimes to have a critical or have a knowledge of where you're actually at, right? Because I think a lot of people don't know where their sidewalk ends as far as skills. And I think it's really important to know kind of where your skills end and other people's begin, so that you can kind of link up with other people.
Yeah. But
one of the things I've noticed is that negative self-talk is just prevalent in our culture like crazy, whether it's looking at Instagram models that are heavily photoshopped, whether it was, some, lady online, or even recently there was something I saw with Jason Momoa, Aquaman, and pictures of him just being regular, and people are like, oh, that's a dad bod. Well, that's his regular body.
Yeah.
People don't realize that he dehydrates and starves. Like, there's a whole physical act to get into, and even makeup and everything else to get into that Aquaman, quote unquote, body. We hold ourselves to these extremely high standards, and I think sometimes we don't cut ourselves enough slack. How would someone deal with that?
Well, I think it's very noble to be ordinary and to accept that and say, sure, am I the most gorgeous person in the world? No. But, my husband loves me and vice versa, and we're happy together. So isn't that enough? Aren't you enough for yourself, for others, for those around you? And social media does not help. I mean, it's a necessary burden today that we need to be where our audience is. I'm definitely on it. I help clients with it. But I don't love it. I'm guilty of waking up in the morning and looking and then saying, why did I start my day that way?
Would you be on social media if you didn't have to be?
I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. I mentioned before we got on the show that I had my 30th high school reunion recently, and a bunch of people were walking around taking selfies and then posting them. And we have a Facebook group for our class. I didn't take one picture, which is unusual for me. And I realized afterwards, it's because I was connecting with people and really talking with them, making eye contact and listening to what they had to say and where they've been for the last 10 years. And I didn't feel the need to record that for other people to see where I was. And I mean, some of my friends took pictures with me, with them. So at least I have that record for myself. But it was enough that night to just really reconnect with some people that I liked. And so I'd like to say today, I wouldn't be on social media as much as I am if I didn't have to. But I think the one use for it is to stay in touch with people that I'm not near, whether it's family or friends, high school classmates, whatever it is. In that way, I like it because I get to see what they're doing, even though they're across the country and we might not get together. But as far as the frequency, I don't think so.
When you look at the kind of folks that you surround yourself with, or people that you work with, even in your practice, what do you look for? What are some key things that you look for? Maybe other people could look for, 2, 3 things to kind of like, oh, this person or this experience is good for me versus this experience is bad for me, or it's starting to drag me down.
So that's a wonderful question. I think that one essential thing in any relationship, be it business or personal, is an appreciation of the other person and what they bring to the table. And hopefully you complement each other or fill in where the other person lacks. And so in business, that's huge because I only want to work with clients where they say that my approach to marketing and PR is a fit and synergy for them and they appreciate my expertise and they like the way I go about it. Because if they don't, there's plenty of others out there that I could refer them to that might be better for them. So that's one thing. And I think in a personal relationship, and I've noticed this, I've been remarried in a second marriage for 8 years and love my husband, but he annoys me at times and I'm sure I annoy him. And I made a decision this time around that each day I would focus on what I love about him. Because if I focus on what annoys me, that's what will carry us and it will not be good for the relationship. And believe me, there's plenty there on both sides, but there's also plenty good. And so it makes me feel better to see the good in him. And I think that's true for anybody.
I mean, that's some pretty powerful stuff. So thinking about your podcast, you've had a wide variety of guests on there. One of my favorite conversations was with Rachel Lutz, who people who are around downtown Detroit or fans of Midtown Detroit know that she runs the Peacock Room, which is just a beloved spot. She has just so much energy. One of the things I liked about it is that you brought out some things, some stories about her that I didn't know. Like I didn't know that she had interned at WDET, for instance, and some things like that. When you're talking to people, what are some of the things that you use to kind of learn about what inspires them or what makes them tick? Because I feel like when you know more about people, you can have better connections with them, right? As opposed to just, well, the weather's great today. Oh, how about them Lions?
So it's a good question. When I started the podcast, I created a questionnaire to do some pre-interviews with guests before we do the actual podcast. So I get their bio, I get their photo, I do a little online research so I know what they've been doing, what their business is all about or whatever. I happen to know Rachel personally, and I love the Peacock Room and Frida and Yama, and I'm just amazed by her entrepreneurship. But there are certain questions on my questionnaire about who inspires you, who is the person or people that you most learn from or look up to, like role models or mentors, and then where do you find meaning and how do you define your purpose? So meaning and purpose can be different things or they can be the same, but I ask some of those questions in multiple ways, and then it sort of draws out details about them that you wouldn't otherwise know. Some people like to take time with it and send me back the answers, and others it's just on the phone, and so it's whatever comes up. But I really create my questions for the interview from that information. And I don't always stick to it, but at least it gives me that context, that depth for the person so that we really dig a little deeper than the surface.
That's actually a really nice trick because I don't think enough people do the pre-interview, right? If they don't know somebody, kind of like figure out, okay, are they going to be somebody who works well on a microphone, right? Because a podcast interview is very different than, say, a print interview. My co-host for this show is actually from print journalism.
Okay.
He worked for the Oakland Press, Associated Press, places like that. And we talked about on a previous episode of the show about how it's a different process to walk people through your questions in real time where you could or hesitate or whatever whenever you wanted to. But here it's a complete experience, and that preparation really pays off.
It really does. We've had one or two, we've been podcasting now for over a year. We've had one or two that we were a little nervous about after the pre-interview. Like, is this person going to be lively enough on the interview? It ended up being okay. But the best interviews, like Rachel was one of the best because she has such personality and she had that experience in radio and she's just such a lively person. But we had the connection. And so I think that building it up and sort of laying that groundwork is really important. I'm also, my first love is writing and my career was really in journalism. So I have those interview skills where I can hear something interesting in what somebody's saying and decide to go with it. And that's what makes a good interview too, because you can't just be like, I have these 5 questions and we have to stick to them. You have to have a conversation, a back and forth that feels natural and is really interesting and sort of takes you to new heights.
One of the things I liked about that interview was that Rachel talked about her why. It's clear that Rachel has like a meaning for what she's doing. But I talk to a lot of people who don't feel like they have any meaning, or don't they don't have a purpose, or they're just kind of like going through, they're working the job, they're working a couple of jobs, but like there isn't the why there, right? For them. How would you advise people to help find their why?
It's a really good question. And that's actually one of the little taglines we've been putting on shirts about the podcast, What's Your Why? Which we didn't create, but it's really quick and quippy. But early in my PR career, I had a lot of yoga clients, and some of them come from really spiritual practices. And I've been very open to absorbing anything from any spirituality, even though my background is Jewish. And so I've traveled to India and to Bali with clients, and I've studied with swamis as part of the work. And one of the things that taught me is that it's a choice. It's a choice to have a purpose, and it's a choice to find meaning. It's how you look at things. It's your perspective. And so it's sometimes a reset. And we all are guilty of it, like saying, oh, this is drudgery. I have 12 things on my to-do list. I can't possibly get them all done. But then sometimes for me, if I go out in nature for a little bit, I'm like, oh, okay, the world is beautiful. It's not all stress. And I took my kids tubing recently on the Huron River. And so you just sit in this tube for 2 hours. And I was like, you know what? The world is good. And so even though it was a little boring, just drifting down the river, it was fun with the kids. It was so beautiful. And I thought, okay, can I do this on a daily basis? Even if it's just going outside and walking through the neighborhood for 20 minutes and look at a tree. On the way here, I saw this really cool tree over on Cass. And it just struck me. And it was because I chose to see that was so beautiful instead of being like, I'm almost late. I have to turn up the light. So I do think that finding your why starts with wanting to see it and wanting to reframe what you're looking at.
That's so funny you mentioned about trees, because every single place I've ever lived, the number one thing I look for are nearby awesome trees. And one of the things I love about being in the city is because in general, it's an older place.
Yeah.
You get some absolutely fabulous trees. I think there literally has been a place that I moved out of once they cut down a bunch of trees near my apartment, because it's one of those things of for me, it was oh, this is something that can ground you and be beautiful and right there. And it's finding that appreciation of the small things, right? If we're having a tough show, there's tough days here with the podcast sometimes. It's hey, we can have just a simple gin and tonic downstairs. How great it is that we're in a shipping container in the middle of Midtown,
yes.
Even though there's a billion other challenges that go on.
Yeah.
To be able to do this. It's something of being thankful and realizing every single, and for different folks, it'll be different words, but for me, every single blessing that you have.
Absolutely. I read recently an idea that somebody had about when you wake up in the morning, instead of looking right at your Instagram, which I'm guilty of at times, starting with a note in your phone, your gratitude list, and just add 3 things when you wake up. So I started doing that, and now the list is growing, and it's the kind of thing you could go back to on one of those dark days.
So I understand you have an event coming up.
I do. So like I said earlier, we're launching this message, meaning, purpose movement. There'll be workshops and seminars and retreats and events, and we're looking to do 3 to 4 events a year. The first one is September 24th at Detroit City Distillery, 5:30 to 7, free of charge. There'll be one Your People custom cocktail for every guest. And we're focusing on what's your story? How do you articulate what makes what you do and who you are really special and differentiate yourself from the competition so that you can use that to market and build brand awareness and ultimately success. So it's not going to be a heavy, in-depth talk. It's going to be quick with some handouts to help people get on that journey, but mostly a fantastic networking opportunity. I love the cocktails at Detroit City Distillery. It's one of my favorite places. And Mike Forsyth, one of the owners, was on the podcast. He was one of our first guests. And so I think that anybody who wants to come out, they can go to yourppl.com/MMP story and reserve their spot, because I know it's going to fill up. So we welcome everyone to come.
Lynne Golodner, thank you so much for stopping by the studio.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that'll do it for today's show. Thanks for listening. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to tell a friend about Daily Detroit.
Let's push Detroit's conversation forward together. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.